Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hamilton campus of Miami University. I'm Mike Pratt, Associate Provost and Dean of the College of Professional Studies and Applied Sciences, and I want to welcome you to tonight's presentation of the Michael J. Culligan Project. Those of you who have seen me up here before know that this is one of my favorite programs, and tonight's speaker is speaking on a topic that was of interest to me long before I became a dean. But my job is to get off the stage quickly, and I want to introduce immediately Dr. Kurt Ellison, who's the director of the Michael J. Culligan Project. Kurt?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let's try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hey, that's good. Well, welcome to the inaugural program of the 2013-14 season for the Michael J. Culligan History Project. We're really glad to see you. After our Miami Valley Heritage Series last spring looked into the 1913 flood and its aftermath, we survived. And we turn now to another theme of the Culligan Project, American Wars and American Life. Tonight, one of the nation's distinguished students of American Indians and American Wars inaugurates our series on the War of 1812 in the West. Your program, your printed program, which you found at your seat, announces some of the coming events in this series, and you can learn about others from a flyer available in the atrium. It looks kind of like this, except the one you pick up will be in color. Please join us for our programs this term. Now, as I begin a fourth year with the Culligan Project, I want to extend gratitude to Dean Pratt and his office at Miami Hamilton, to the Culligan staff, especially Matthew Smith and LaDonna Hoskins, to Brett Couch, the director of the Wilkes Center, to our videographer, Greg Rouse, and our director of marketing, Shelley Diano, for their key support that makes it possible to produce these programs. Tonight, I also want to thank the Organization of American Historians. Their distinguished lectureship program certainly lives up to its billing as a dynamic and reliable resource for securing leading historians for public history programs. And I also want to thank the Culligan Fund Committee of the Hamilton Community Foundation. Their support for this work is crucial, and it has been sustained over the lifetime of this project, which right now enters its 14th year. I know that Committee Chair Mike Dingledine is here, and along with other members, Dave Ballou, Jim Blunt, Bob Cottrell, Susan Myers, and Karen Whalen. There might be other members who have come in, but I haven't met them here this evening. There are two other members, John Gaduli of the Hamilton Community Foundation and Mayor Pat Muller. Please join me in thanking them sincerely for their great support of public history. Now, I'm very pleased to call upon someone familiar to many in this audience, a compelling interpreter of American history, early American life, and American warfare. He will appear here later this fall when he facilitates a panel discussion on the War for the Great Lakes. To introduce tonight's speaker, Miami University Distinguished Professor Andrew Caton.
Good evening to everyone. There were two reasons I was very excited that Kurt asked me to introduce our speaker tonight, and one reason I was sadly disappointed and almost said no. Let me get to that one in a minute. First of all, happy to be here because I get to introduce a distinguished American historian. But I also, the second reason I'm happy to do it is that at last, on one of these evenings of all these thank yous, we get to say thank you to some other people as well. And that is the terrific people who make the Culligan Project work so well. I'm thinking of LaDonna Hoskins. Are you here somewhere, LaDonna? There you are. Matthew Smith, the Assistant Director of the Colligan Project, who arranges all these things for you. And finally, our good friend from Alabama, Dr. Curtis Ellison, back there in the back. So thank you. Michael J. Colligan History Project is truly one of the jewels in the crown of Hamilton and of the Hamilton campus of Miami University, and we're all proud to be associated with it. The reason I really didn't want to do this is because my 8th grade Ohio history teacher would be sorely disappointed at me, since he was without doubt one of the greatest Ohio State football fans who ever lived. And here I find myself in between a graduate of the University of Alabama and a faculty member at the university of a place I will not mention. However, I will soldier on, and if none of you report me to him, wherever he might be, I will be in your debt. You see Greg Dowd's many achievements on the program tonight. I could talk about his education, his Princeton PhD, his work with one of the most distinguished trainers of graduate students in early American history, and certainly one of the most distinguished early American historians, the legendary John Murren. And I could talk about his many academic achievements, including his teaching career at the University of Notre Dame and his current position as professor of history and professor of American culture at the University of Michigan. We could talk about the honors he's held, including fellowships at the Newberry Library. We could talk about his time as a Fulbright professor in South Africa. And we could talk about his many publications, principally his 2 very well-known and very important books, A Spirited Resistance, The North American Indian Struggle for Unity, and The War Under Heaven, a book about Pontiac and the British Empire. But what I want to say to you is that Greg Dowd, as by way of introduction, by way of context, is that Greg Dowd is one of the leading members of a generation of historians who has truly transformed the field that I teach, early American history. When I was a graduate student back at Brown University in the 1970s, I wrote a dissertation about the Ohio country in which I don't know that I actually mentioned the word Indian. Maybe I did 3 or 4 times, but I seriously doubt it. And part of the reason for that was that very few academic historians actually talked much about American Indians. Greg, along with a whole generation of other scholars who came of age in the same time I did and published books in the 1980s and early 1990s, including A Spirited Resistance, transformed all that. Reading Greg's book, A Spirited Resistance, was a major moment in my scholarly career and certainly changed my approach to teaching early American history and my approach to writing early American history. And that's one of the major reasons why I'm very, very glad to welcome you here tonight. You are lucky to hear a terrific teacher, a terrific speaker, and certainly a historian who, along with many of his compatriots, has actually changed the way in which we think and talk about American history. So tonight, he's going to talk to us about Tecumseh, and it is my pleasure to give to you Greg Dowd.
Thanks, Drew. I wish my mom were here to hear it. I've heard that. Is the sound okay? Is it okay? Good. All right, I want to thank LaDonna Hoskins, first of all, who helped me get here, and Matthew Smith and Kurt Ellison and Michael Pratt and Drew and all of you in the Culligan History Project for making this possible. And I'll get right to it. I'm going to talk about a series of legends or stories that we might think of as legends tonight, because legends, I think, spike some of our best professional histories and biographies dealing with Tecumseh. And Tecumseh is clearly the most famous Indian of the War of 1812. So since I'm talking about legends, I should probably explain what I mean by the word legend. By the word legend, I mean a poorly grounded story set in the past that carries cultural power. Legends are about history. They are set in the past to explain the present, but they are actually the enemy of professional history. Professional history has to try to get the past right. I know that's an old-fashioned idea, but I think most of us actually do adhere to that. A legend, on the other hand, is a groundless historical story that expresses cultural values. Legends are important, they're even necessary, but they're not professional history. So I want to question two sets of legends about Tecumseh. I'm giving each of these my own title, and I'm going to title the first one, Tecumseh, the Shawnee Federalist. According to this legend, Tecumseh, the virtuous unifier of American Indian peoples, had more in common with, say, George Washington than he did with most other Native Americans, or even with his own brother, Tenskwatawa, the so-called Shawnee prophet. Tecumseh was, according to this legend, a rare Native American nationalist, a genius, struggling against ancient local tribalism. And he relied on his brother's religious movement only as long as it served his purpose, which was to break the tribal grip that ensnared American Indians so that they could unite against the expanding United States. Unlike his brother, and more than most Indians, he was a worthy enemy, and his worth raises the value of the American conquest and the valor of his conquerors. This legend set has two subordinate themes. First, that American Indians were a tribal people, and second, that Tecumseh's statesman-like vision differed sharply from that of his brother, Tenskwatawa the Zealot. So legend set one, in brief, has Tecumseh as a secular Shawnee Federalist, struggling to transform superstitious tribal people into anti-colonial nationalists and co-opting his brother's religious movement in order to do so. The second set of legends I'll question is a little different, and I'm going to call this set of stories Apocalypse 1812. According to this set of stories, so dramatic was Tecumseh's struggle over the future of North America that even the heavens, and I kind of have to put it this way, yea, even the very bowels of the earth, entered the fray with a solar eclipse, a brilliant comet, and a series of profound earthquakes. So let's start with Tecumseh the Shawnee Federalist. Historian R. David Edmonds has two fine books on the subjects of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. His short biography of Tecumseh is widely taught, and rightly so. I have assigned it with success to undergraduates. My own work depends on Tecumseh's findings, particularly his finding that, on Edmonds' findings. My own work depends on R. David Edmonds' findings, especially his early finding that Tecumseh's role in the formation of the movement was entirely secondary to that of Tenskwatawa. I also stand on Edmonds' findings that the brothers' movement was not only against the United States, but also against other tribal leaders who accepted American payments and signed treaties with the Americans. And I'll return to that theme shortly. Now for my quibbles with some of Dave's work, early work. Dave plausibly stated that Tecumseh subscribed to his brother's faith, but he also then suggests that Tecumseh later began to challenge the prophet's position of leadership following the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne, which inspired Tecumseh to travel widely in quest of his intertribal movement. And in this post-Treaty of Fort Wayne period, this post-1809 period, according to Edmonds, Tecumseh emerged as the real leader. And what is more, Tecumseh began to distinguish his leadership from that of Tenskwatawa and openly broke with him in 1809 following the Battle of Tippecanoe. after which Tenskwatawa was a broken man and Tecumseh emerged as the true leader, essentially busting Tenskwatawa from prophet to charlatan. Both Alfred Cave of the University of Toledo and I have challenged these arguments about Tenskwatawa's fall from grace, suggesting that neither the Treaty of Fort Wayne, 1809, nor even the Battle of Tippecanoe, 1811, irreparably damaged Tenskwatawa's leadership of the movement, at least of the religious movement. Cave argues plausibly that Tenskwatawa handled William Henry Harrison's invasion of Tippecanoe with great care and skill. And recently, Adam Jortner of Auburn University has examined the battle and largely concurs that Tenskwatawa was a cautious and resourceful leader. Cave and Jortner dispute the conventional story that had Tenskwatawa order the assault and promise protection from bullets. By the end of the battle, William Henry Harrison had lost more men than had Tenskwatawa. It's certainly true that Harrison took the field, but only after the Native American opponents ran out of ammunition. So that was in mid-November 1811. By January 1812, Tenskwatawa had repopulated the village with 550 people, still inspired by his vision. Jortner, echoing Cave, declares it manifestly untrue that the battle broke the Shawnee visionary's political influence. Both Harrison and his Indian enemies claimed it a victory, and on each side, skeptics called it a defeat. So Harrison had his American critics, the prophet. Tenskwatawa had his Native American critics. The Battle of Tippecanoe began a war, but it did not push Tenskwatawa out of Tecumseh's way because Tenskwatawa never blocked his brother's path. They stood together, and they stood with many, many others. Now I want to take another view of the matter. What were the roots of the idea that Tecumseh championed? What were the roots of pan-Indian resistance? Was Tecumseh a rare Native American genius to be considering intertribal organization against an expanding Western power? Let's look at an intrepid Shawnee who was aware that his people needed widespread alliances against the invaders from the east. He went southward from his Ohio Valley homeland practically to the Gulf of Mexico. He was well known to several military officers and to numerous traders. This intrepid Shawnee, however, was not Tecumseh, and the year was not 1811. The year was 1764, and the name sits in the record as Charlot Casquet. Tecumseh had not even been born. Casquet, who lived in the Shawnee country on the upper Ohio River, had boarded a convoy bound from Illinois to New Orleans. Once in the Crescent City, he spoke to the French governor and to assembled lower Mississippi Valley Indians. He claimed to represent 47 villages, each of which was marked on a great wampum belt that he held in his hand. This was 50 years before the conclusion of the War of 1812. Tecumseh's trip southward is often seen as a revolutionary departure from tribal Indian norms, but it had a lot of precedent. I could give other examples. Unfortunately, in the quest of time, I actually have to skip over one of them. But episodes like this and others make it clear that before the American Revolution, the idea of united Indian resistance to settler expansion had already lit conversations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Tecumseh's trip southward may have been, as his most detailed biography has stated, arguably the most impressive journey ever made on behalf of Indian unity. Maybe it was, but maybe it wasn't. There were a lot of other such trips. Tecumseh was following in many footsteps. Shawnees got around, but so did other Indians. There's good evidence, for example, that Cherokees and Creeks headed north to participate in intertribal forms of resistance from the American Revolution onward. Indeed, even as Tecumseh was returning homeward in late 1811, Creeks from Georgia or Alabama were identified among the dead at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which marked the beginning, not the end, of the War of 1812, the Indians' War of 1812 anyway. Shawnees, Creeks, and others had many reasons to form alliances. Interestingly enough, the United States was not their only concern. For example, in Tecumseh's own day, Shawnees and Creeks increasingly hunted and met with relatives who had moved across the Mississippi River. There, those Indians hunting and the Indians who had migrated there from the Ohio Valley butted up against the expanding Osage Indian power. In 1804, American Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins had been concerned about a growing Creek Indian alliance against the Osage Indians in the West, an alliance that included Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Delawares, and Shawnees. Hawkins observed that they had united themselves against the Osages. Well, if peoples from Ohio to the Gulf of Mexico could discuss unity against the Osages, how much more difficult was it for them to discuss unity against the United States? Not only did Tecumseh stand with his brother against U.S. expansion, but the idea of unity was older than either of the two men. Religiously charged pan-Indian unity was a developing tradition. And other visionary leaders, such as Maine Pock of the Potawatomi or the Trout among the Ottawas, gave it voice. Until relatively recently, historians interpreting such Indian efforts at unity had to strain against a dominant organizational model that saw Indians as, above all else, tribal people. Historians had to make sense of a movement that was not tribal, a movement that seemed to violate tribalism, when tribalism, historians thought, constituted a core Indian principle. Tribal peoples, such, I'll call it legendary, thinking had it, identified solely with their own tribes and could not conceive of the advantages of unity. Only such geniuses as Tecumseh or Pontiac before him, thrown up by nature like mutant DNA, rose above their peers to challenge the stolid minds of their tribes. In 1810, Harrison called Tecumseh a genius. Here is William Henry Harrison writing as Tecumseh was on his southern tour in 1811 and as Harrison prepared to strike Tippecanoe. The implicit obedience and respect which the followers of Tecumseh pay to him is really astonishing, and more than any other circumstance bespeaks him one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions. He is now upon the last round to put a finishing stroke to his work. I hope, however, before his return, that part of the fabric which he considered complete will be demolished and even its foundations rooted up. This particular U.S. view of Tecumseh, the Shawnee Federalist, lived on through the 20th century in works describing Tecumseh as a peculiarly brilliant Indian for conceiving of a bold plan for Indian unity. Fairly typical is this historian's 1965 statement. Tecumseh realized what few Indians ever saw. Only if all tribes made common cause could they hope to contain the United States. So far, in contrast, I have suggested that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa stood together and that there was nothing all that new about pan-Indian thought. Did it take particular genius to overcome tribalism? A recent wave of scholarship Scholarship on Native Americans before, say, 1850 offers us yet more reason for doubt. This literature, written largely in the last decade, reveals that Native Americans did not, in 1800, typically inhabit a world of loyalties defined by the tribe, at least not by the tribe alone, certainly not by the tribe alone. On works questioning the tribe, I'm going to start small and then get big. So starting small, we'll take the work of Joshua Piker. Not that it's small work, just that he focuses on a town. He's written a great history of the Creek town of Okfuskee. And he points out that scholars have become increasingly wary of referring to the Indians of early America as tribal peoples. For Piker, it was the town or village that mattered, and he assembles a massive evidence showing that this local loyalty was highly important. Other scholars, such as Toronto's Heidi Bohacker, have emphasized not villages, but kinship networks that linked, in her case, Ojibwas together across villages and bands, but through kinship networks and clan structures. So having started small with the village and the family, let's think big. Tribes, as entities uniting villages and clans, often with a shared language, competed with the rise of other larger social formations. We could call these alliances, even empires. Some Native American alliances and alliance networks, and you can think of the League of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, you can think of the Comanche Empire. Some of these lasted centuries and dominated large stretches of the continent. Some of them existed without much European support, and in many, Europeans played precious little role. The rise of the Osages in the Arkansas Valley. So some of this scholarship has been written by people like Pekka Hamilinen or Juliana Barr, Kathleen Duval, Ned Blackhawk, who write on the rise of the Osages or the Comanches in the West and the southern Great Plains. Massive social formations. Michael Witkin on the Dakota and Ojibwas in the Prairie West and the Great Lakes, western Great Lakes. Large social formations that go beyond the tribe. And these rise independently of Europeans during the time in which Tecumseh is a boy and a young man. So having treated some of the smaller things and the bigger things, let's look at the thing itself, the tribe. Specifically, a tribal government in the Old Northwest at the time of Tecumseh. It was anything but traditional and static. After the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the United States secured a claim in European eyes basically to the Mississippi River. It's a little more complicated than that, but roughly to the Mississippi River. Officials quickly argued that the United States held rights to Indian land by right of conquest, and the United States started imposing treaties on Shawnees, Delawares, and others. These people resisted by organizing a Western Indian Alliance, which threw back, as you probably know, major invading expeditions, some of them departing from places like Hamilton in 1790 and 1791. Now, in 1794, Anthony Wayne, under orders from Washington, invaded the region and defeated intertribal forces at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, 1794. But this was not a pure conquest, as the treaty that followed it would reveal. Although the historic Treaty of Greenville, 1795, was not the first made by the United States with Indians, a recent compendium lists 22 preceding it, it did illustrate a shift in the federal approach to Indians. As Francis Jennings pointed out a generation ago, Anthony Wayne's instructions were to disavow American conquest and to assert negotiation, to renounce explicitly the recent interpretation of the Peace of Paris as implying an American conquest of the interior. This construction of the Peace of Paris, Wayne was informed, was as, quote, unfounded in itself as it was unintelligible and mysterious to the Indians, end quote. The land is theirs, and this we acknowledge. The United States acknowledged that it had to gain at least plausible Indian consent to its western expansion, a practice it followed, often implausibly. When the Indians treated Greenville in 1795, they surrendered a great deal in land and autonomy. Miami University historian Drew Caton convincingly argues that federal leaders in the early republic, while determined to dominate Indians, nonetheless craved Indian consent in a kind of democratic patriarchy, in quotation marks. The treaty and the regime it ushered, and this is the crucial point, strengthened structures that brought many Indian tribal nations within the American empire, while recognizing, in some limited measure, their separate national standing and the imperative to negotiate with them. This potential for Indian tribal nationhood in an American federal system stands as a historic achievement, one seized by Indians, if you will, from the jaws of defeat, and one that many Indians remain determined to protect and to advance to this day. The militant coalitions from Charlotte Casquet's time to the mid-18th century and through Tecumseh's period have something to do with the origins and entrenchment of this, but it also is the case that the tribal structures were emerging at this time and consolidating at this time in concert with and in conflict with, as well, the United States. Dave Edmonds demonstrated long ago that militants like Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa rejected the authority of these emerging tribal governments, and they denounced the treaties that the leaders of these tribal governments made. Militants denied, for example, that the Miami leader, Mishikanawaka, or Little Turtle, could legitimately cede Indian land. In short, the modern American tribal nation emerged in counterpoint to the development of the United States, and also it did so in competition with other broader Indian identities advanced by the Shawnee brothers in what is now the American heartland. In the Greenville Treaty and in other treaties, the United States promised annual payments, commonly called annuities, that would be paid separately to the tribes. Given to Indian leaders to redistribute among their people, these annuities gave the Americans influence within the tribal structures that were developing. By the winter of 1805-1806, when Tenskwatawa, or the Shawnee prophet, began to preach, the Shawnee Blackhoof, or Katahekasa, a signer of the Treaty of Greenville, had secured recognition by the United States as the leader of his tribe. So Blackhoof became the chief conduit for the passage of U.S. annuities. He became the so-called leader of the Shawnees in American eyes, and Tenskwatawa challenged him. It's no accident that Tenskwatawa set up his first major village in 1806 at Greenville, the very site of the treaty. Tenskwatawa was symbolically rejecting that treaty, a treaty that both Blackhoof and Little Turtle had signed, a treaty that formalized these new tribal structures. It's no accident that he set up his second major village in 1808 at Tippecanoe, right in the Miami territory that the USA deemed to be under the authority of Little Turtle. These were bold challenges to major tribal leaders. They were also challenges to the United States. Tenskwatawa and his followers most vocally condemned the tribal leaders' selling of land to the United States. Between 1804 and 1808, the governors of Indiana and Michigan territories had negotiated a half a dozen land cession treaties with the tribal leaders. The federal government paid for these grants of land with increased annuities to be distributed through the recognized tribal structures. This again, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh objected to these opponents of the chiefs. The payments reeked of bribery. Now, from the perspective of Blackhoof and Little Turtle, the United States was probably the only game in town. Great Britain had clearly abandoned the militants in 1794, 1795. They had earlier tried to organize against the United States in a Western Confederacy, but that had not fully protected their lands. Blackhoof and Little Turtle also had vision. They had a vision that was, in some ways, as radically new as that of Tecumseh or that of Tenskwatawa. They were hardly mere collaborators or sellouts. They advocated innovative forms of Indian organization that might maintain some Native American autonomy. The changes they envisioned were very different from that of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, but they were not static. In 1809, the annuity chief Little Turtle and others unwittingly, perhaps even negligently, galvanized their Indian opponents with another land cession. William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, proceeded to negotiate the Treaty of Fort Wayne, and this treaty ceded over 2.5 million acres to the United States. Tenskwatawa's brother Tecumseh, meanwhile, entered the historical record, speaking out against the tribal chiefs long targeted by Tenskwatawa. In August 1810, Tecumseh informed Harrison that he intended to destroy the village chiefs by whom all the mischief is done. It is they who sell our land to the Americans. And by village chiefs, he meant the tribal leaders, such as Blackhoof and Little Turtle. He asked Harrison to repudiate the Fort Wayne Treaty because the tribal leaders had no right to sell the land to the United States. Now, he did not threaten Harrison with war or the United States with war. Rather, he threatened, quote, to kill all the chiefs who sold you this land, end quote. So what I'm arguing here is that a pan-Indian tradition reaching back into the 18th century was confronting an emerging tribal tradition that also reached back into the 18th century, but that both were emerging. They were two traditions. Neither was ancient, neither was immutable. Both were a product of history. Each had a radically different take on Indian identity and on the future. And they confronted each other as Indians headed toward their own Civil War of 1812. To borrow a phrase from Alan Taylor, because Native Americans would oppose one another in the War of 1812. Now, to conclude this first segment on Tecumseh, the Shawnee Federalist, we don't know much about Tecumseh's religiosity per se, but there is no good direct evidence that he challenged his brother's movement or cynically co-opted his brother's movement, which had roots in the 18th century. The movement's main obstacle was not a long tradition of tribalism, which is, I think, itself legendary, but the new emerging form of tribal government that had been established under the influence of the United States. Now, my second segment on legends about Tecumseh might be titled, as I've said, Apocalypse 1812. And it's here, as we like to say, that things get weird. According to this cluster of stories, the heavens and the depths of the earth materially entered the fray with a solar eclipse, a brilliant comet, and a series of profound earthquakes. According to very good scholars, Tenskwatawa gained authority by convincing credulous Indians that he had caused an eclipse of the sun in June 1806. The story has it that William Henry Harrison, sometime before mid-April of that year, had called upon the Delawares of the White River, Indiana, which is where Tenskwatawa had been living before, to test Tenskwatawa's power by insisting, among other things, that Tenskwatawa stop the sun. So William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, apparently called upon the Indians to challenge Tenskwatawa, hey, have that guy stop the sun in its tracks. Now, Harrison made that demand, it seems. There's an undated letter. It's one of the first letters Harrison has to mention the Shawnee prophets, so I have some doubts about when he wrote it. But it's also, the reason I think he probably did make the demand is that the missionaries, the Moravian missionaries at White River, noted that the Delawares received a demand like that. But they also noted that the Indians received it with indifference. That's what they say, that they received it with indifference. They didn't care about it. It's also true, as we know, that there was a solar eclipse visible in much of the region in the late morning of June 16, 1806. So let's assume that Harrison made the demand, that it actually got to the Indians. That much is history. It's pretty good evidence, good enough that we can call it history. But now I'm going to jump into the legend. The legend adds here that Tenskwatawa, responding to Harrison's challenge and somehow aware of the coming eclipse, I don't know how that happened, deployed it and claimed power over the sun. Fine work on Harrison and Tecumseh, published last year by Oxford University Press, states all this. And I want to be plain. There is no good evidence, and none at all, from 1806 to 1820, that Tenskwatawa made any claims about the sun, or that any of his followers believed in this period that he had anything to do with the darkening sun. The Moravian missionaries at White River, Indiana, where Harrison had sent his letter, say nothing at all of the eclipse ever in their journals. The entry for the day of the eclipse reads like this: haymaking was begun. The weather was most favorable. And while they go on in the following months to denounce Indian superstitions and to fear Tenskwatawa's movement, they say nothing about the eclipse. It apparently created no fuss among the Indians they knew, despite their connection to Tenskwatawa and to the people at Greenville. The evidence that Harrison challenged Tecumseh to stop the sun is pretty good. Some reason to doubt it, but it's pretty good. We have two sources, actually, so I'd say that's good history. But the evidence that the Shawnee visionary was thought by his followers to have predicted the eclipse is highly unreliable. It's all memoir, it's recorded decades after the fact, and it's recorded by his enemies. That the story resonates with other such eclipse stories, like Columbus in 1504, doing pretty much the same thing to oppress the Arawaks, or 17th century Jesuits in New France trying to impress Indians, or Jesuits in China trying to impress the Chinese. This should further raise our eyebrows. It's kind of legendary. It begins to sound like an urban legend, like a kind of a repetitive rumor, like the alligators in the sewage system. And then there is that good book, the Bible. Tenskwatawa was derided by Americans as the prophet. By implication, a false prophet. And I also suspect that when they call him the prophet, there is an element of Islam in there. There's an element of thinking about Islam. Tenskwatawa was derided as a prophet, and predicting power over the sun is what the real prophets did. Ezekiel 32:7. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10. But despite the bad evidence and the other reasons for suspicion, this story repeatedly gets into the history books. It reveals Tenskwatawa as a false prophet, as a man who deliberately deceived his own people. I really doubt the story. It's bad history, but it's very good legend. As widely credited as is the story of Tenskwatawa and the eclipse, so are cosmic stories associated with Tecumseh's famous journey south in 1811. Here, Tecumseh arrives in the south just as the Great Comet of 1811 appears. And then shortly after Tecumseh leaves the south, earthquakes rumble. In several very fine histories, the comet and the quakes contribute to the nativist, red stick, Native American Creek movement in the South that allied with Tecumseh's movement against the United States. You know, it's very complicated, but that's ultimately what happened during the War of 1812. Historian John Sugden, provides the most thorough and impressive reconstitution of Tecumseh's southern journey. Sugden's Tecumseh convincingly reached the Creek town of Tukabatchee on September 19, 1811. The Great Comet, and it was real, had already, toward the end of August, appeared in the night skies. And I don't know how many of you might remember, if you had a chance to see the comet Hale-Bopp in the mid-90s. Apparently this comet resembled that. I mean, the astronomers think that they were roughly the same. So fairly impressive comet. So it was in the night skies toward the end of August, and it was kind of at its zenith in early September. So it's true enough that the comet was there when Tecumseh arrived, and according to Sugden and many other historians, Tecumseh seized upon the comet's appearance as alluding to it, and alluded to it as an omen that boded ill to his enemies. Now, another legend in another land, not incidentally, I think, has it that Napoleon did pretty much the same thing as he faced Russia. Then, back in America, beginning on December 16, 1811, earthquakes came and occasionally rumbled through early February 1812. And according to John Sugden, none were more astonished than Indian peoples. And they were astonished because, in Sugden's interpretation, Tecumseh had already armed them with an explanation that angry sacred forces called for resistance. That's a great story. There's just no evidence, no good evidence for it. I am unconvinced that either the comet or the quakes mattered more to the Creeks than they did to other people in North America. Creeks were seismically divided before the earthquakes. Tecumseh's call for intertribal unity against both the United States and tribal leaders who cooperated with the United States did not need earthquakes to convince a strong Creek faction to oppose its government and to oppose the United States. What's more, war broke out in the north at Tippecanoe among similarly divided Native American peoples before the first round of earthquakes. And note this well, militant Creek Indians from the south died in that November action in Indiana, November 1811, before the quakes. So Creek Indians were already dying before the earthquakes happened in conflict with the United States. The ideas that tie Tecumseh to comets and earthquakes and comets to the war are very misleading. The stories are bogus, but I like them. And I like them because although they are groundless and although they are false, they contain a kind of a glimmer of truth. And that nugget of truth is that there was a spiritual dimension to this conflict, and that many Native Americans were motivated, in part at least, by ideas about the sacred. It's just that this kind of argument gets those ideas wrong. At least they acknowledge its force, they acknowledge the force of the sacred and thinking about the sacred, but they get it wrong. To be sure, Earthquakes were there. They did happen. They were serious. Centered in northeastern Arkansas, they were felt in late 1811 and early 1812 across much of eastern North America, including Creek Country. But in southern Alabama and Georgia, it isn't as if houses were falling down, not even creek houses, which were not particularly substantial. Livestock got nervous, people got nervous, but it isn't as if there was huge damage in that region. There was a lot of damage elsewhere, and yet nobody says in those regions that the earthquakes were a particular cause of the War of 1812. Let's look at a document, the best document, the most proximate in time. Historians kind of like documents that are close to the event in time and place. And we do have an article published by somebody who claimed to be among the Creeks, a guy named Francis McHenry. The article was published in June 1812, which is pretty close to the events. It was by a man named Francis McHenry, as I've said. As to his trustworthiness, that's debatable. Benjamin Hawkins, who was the Indian agent, the U.S. Indian agent among the Creeks, thought he was a liar. And he wasn't referring to this particular article, but elsewhere he just refers to him as a liar. Anyway, McHenry's article, let's look at it. It's called The Indian Prophet. Interestingly enough, even the title is a little bizarre because he's talking about Tecumseh, yet he calls him the Indian Prophet, suggesting that he mistakes Tecumseh for his brother. But let's put that aside. It's an interesting point to put aside, but let's put it aside. So the Indian prophet, Tecumseh, visited the Creeks in August 1811. He says August, it was September. That's not unimportant. I'll get to that in a minute. He predicted the comet, and he warned that if the Creeks did not attack the whites, the earth would ere long tremble. I love it that he writes ere long, as if Tecumseh spoke ancient English instead of contemporary English, but that's okay. That McHenry also mistakes the Shawnee's visit as happening in August is significant. It's not a mere slip because it happened in September, but you can't predict a comet in September because it's already there, so he had to back it up into August. So Tecumseh's September arrival would wreck that prediction. All right, moving on. McHenry's entire article is mainly a lesson in bad earth science. I'll call it a bad lesson in bad earth science because McHenry posits that comets cause earthquakes. That's the main point of this argument. Is that, how do we explain earthquakes? Well, it's comets that cause them. And in fact, we know comets cause them, and not only do we know comets cause them, but the prophet knew that comets caused earthquakes because the prophet had been to Canada where he had learned astronomy, and he had learned astronomy, from astronomy he had learned that the comet was coming. Well, as it happens, the comet was unknown to Western science until February 1811, so even that's impossible. It's a crazy article. It's appallingly bad evidence for anything having to do with Tecumseh's visit to the Creeks, and yet this professional historians have relied upon in order to make this case. Why? Once the quakes had sounded and vibrated in Creek Country, Red Sticks who allied with Tecumseh may well have posited them as signs favorable to their movement. That's plausible to me. Sure. But it remains a hypothetical point. We don't have any evidence for it. And it raises the famous question, one of my favorite questions, so what? Anglo-Americans also said all kinds of things about the earthquakes. Alan Taylor's recent book on the war mentions the comet and the quakes, and he cites evidence of eschatological concern among U.S. citizens. But for Taylor, the phenomena merely add to, quote, a sense of dread. My colleague Susan Juster similarly finds much discussion in the popular United States print media about the earthquakes and the comet. Christian prophets were quite concerned with these phenomena, and they depict they raised a sense of concern, of grave concern among United States citizens. But no one, to my knowledge, and perhaps some of you can correct me, no one to my knowledge has ever argued that the earthquakes or the comet had any serious influence on the United States declaration of war on Great Britain, and yet that is what is effectively being posited for Creek Indians under the influence of Tecumseh. So there is a much published but poorly documented record of Tecumseh's alleged speech to the Creeks. We actually have no idea what he said to the Creeks. But the record of his alleged speech to the Creeks is very thick with scriptural resonance. The Shawnee would stamp his foot at Tippecanoe, and the very earth shall shake. That's a quotation, the very earth shall shake. That's how he must have spoken in this biblical manner. This is pretty close to the prophets Joel. If you would look at chapter 2, verse 10, and 3, verse 13, and Haggai, if you look at chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. I love preaching like this. These stories are more legend than history. They resonate more with the racial assumptions of Victorian Americans and with Christian notions of false prophecy than they do with the historical record. But they contain, as I've said, a nugget of truth. Stories of nativists being moved by Tecumseh's claims about comets and earthquakes resemble those told about Tenskwatawa's shrewd, if implausible, use of the 1806 eclipse. These stories equate Tecumseh with his brother, and that is how many U.S. officials in the South at the time saw him. Not so much in the North, but in the South. They saw him as a leader of a religious movement hostile to the United States, just like his brother. Andrew Jackson called him the emissary of the prophet. So Jackson thought that Tecumseh had been sent by the prophet to the South. He wasn't on Tecumseh's mission. He was on his brother's mission. U.S. agent Benjamin Hawkins thought that Tecumseh was the Shawnee prophet. And Hawkins is the guy who hated McHenry, the author of the article, who also thought that Tecumseh was the Shawnee prophet. So Tecumseh in these stories is less a Shawnee Federalist than he is a zealous militant, or even worse, a false prophet. So as I approach the conclusion, let me return to the Battle of Tippecanoe. It forms a key moment in what I call the legend of Tecumseh the Shawnee Federalist. Here, Tecumseh returned to the north from the south, only to find in late 1811 that Tenskwatawa had prematurely fought William Henry Harrison. Tecumseh grows furious in this interpretation. He denounced the false prophet. He grabbed him like an angry Zeus abusing Folly, and this is what Zeus did. He grabs Folly by the hair and shook her. But in this case, Tecumseh shakes his brother, shook him, bringing an end to Tenskwatawa's influence. This story, I will add, originated in a biography of Tecumseh by the campaign biographer of William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Drake. As Harrison had triumphed over the worthy Tecumseh, so had Tecumseh condemned the false prophet. But in my examination of U.S. military correspondence in the year after the battle, it's clear not only that Tenskwatawa remained influential into 1812 and reestablished his village at Tippecanoe, but U.S. officers commonly referred to their Indian enemy as the prophet's party, not Tecumseh's party. All of this interpretation has precedent. I didn't come up with it all. Over 100 years ago, scholars debunked portions of this earthquake story. And about 30 years ago, Dave Edmonds began the serious exploration of Tenskwatawa's influence on history. And if I were to be taken to task for being a kind of a wise guy historian, taking cheap shots at fine scholars who have made real contributions to our field, I'd have to say that's actually, in some sense, true. I'm sure anyone picking over my own work would find that I have also been strongly influenced by trends in American culture and American legend. But it's precisely because legends have cultural power, because they serve purposes other than getting the past right. We should be aware of legends. We should beware of legends that pass for history, even when that legendary tradition is an earth-shakingly good story. Thank you.